The alchemist stands before the furnace, not as a chemist seeking gold, but as a philosopher seeking something far more elusive, the dissolution of what he believes himself to be. This is not metaphor. This is not poetry. This is the raw acknowledgement that the greatest obstacle to transformation is not the base metal before him, but the constructed identity within him. The medieval alchemical tradition understood something that modern psychology has only begun to rediscover, that the ego, the consolidated sense of I, is not a fixed entity, but a fluid construction, a narrative maintained through constant psychological effort. The alchemists called this false identity the impure matter, the unrefined ore, the corrupted substance, that must undergo the terrible process of the Nigredo, the blackening, before any authentic self can emerge. But here lies the paradox that Jung himself danced around without fully articulating. The ego that seeks transformation is the very obstacle to transformation. The I that desires to become enlightened is the prison that prevents enlightenment. The personality that wishes to transcend itself is using the tools of limitation to attempt the work of liberation. The alchemical texts, written in their deliberately obscure symbolic language, were not hiding chemical formulas from the uninitiated. They were protecting a dangerous psychological truth, that the dissolution of the ego structure feels phenomenologically like death itself. The Nigredo is not a pleasant shadow work exercise recommended by contemporary therapists. It is the systematic dismantling of every defense mechanism, every self-concept, every cherished belief about who and what one is. When the Rosarium Philosophorum speaks of putrefaction and mortification, it is describing the psychological experience of watching one's carefully constructed identity decompose. When it warns that without death there is no resurrection, it is not speaking metaphorically. It is describing the actual phenomenology of ego dissolution, the terror, the resistance, the desperate clinging to familiar patterns of thought and behavior, even as they reveal themselves to be hollow. The alchemical work begins not with technique, but with recognition. The brutal recognition that what one calls myself is a fiction maintained through selective attention, motivated reasoning, and an exhausting expenditure of psychological energy. The aspirant does not enter the great work seeking self-improvement. Self-improvement is the ego's final defense mechanism, its last attempt to remain in control by appropriating the language of transformation while avoiding actual change. The work begins when the seeker realizes that the problem is not that the ego is insufficiently developed, but that it has become a tyrant masquerading as a protector. The philosophical foundation of alchemical psychology rests on a radical premise that neither Jung nor his successors fully articulated. The ego is not merely a psychic structure that can be refined or improved. It is fundamentally an illusion, a necessary fiction that crystallizes during psychological development, but must eventually be recognized as such if authentic selfhood is to emerge. This diverges sharply from Jung's own formulation. Jung treated the ego as a legitimate center of consciousness that needed to be maintained even as it entered into relationship with the self. He wrote extensively about ego-self axis, about the necessity of a strong ego for psychological health, about the dangers of inflation when the ego identifies with archetypal contents. All of this is clinically sound, pragmatically useful, and philosophically insufficient. The alchemists understood something more radical. The ego is not an entity to be strengthened or weakened, integrated or dissolved. It is a perceptual error, a case of mistaken identity that has consolidated into felt experience. The medieval texts speak of the philosophical Mercury as that which is simultaneously poison and medicine, destroyer and redeemer. This is not chemical Mercury. This is the reflexive capacity of consciousness to take itself as an object, to observe the observer, to question the questioner. When the Emerald Tablet declares that what is below is like what is above, it is not proposing a vague correspondence between macrocosm and microcosm. It is stating a precise psychological principle. The structure of the ego mirrors the structure of the cosmos because both are constructions of the same consciousness. The ego believes itself to be a bounded entity, separate from the world precisely because it has forgotten its own creative role in drawing that boundary. The alchemical doctrine of the prima materia, the first matter from which all substances emerge and to which all return, is a phenomenological description of consciousness prior to self-differentiation. Before the ego crystallizes, before the subject-object split hardens into felt experience, there is simply awareness without an owner of awareness. The prima materia is not a substance to be found, but a condition to be remembered. This is where Jung's formulation becomes conservative, even protective. He recognized that the complete dissolution of ego structure could result in psychosis, in the flooding of consciousness with archetypal material that the personality cannot integrate. He was clinically correct, but clinical correctness is not the same as philosophical truth. The alchemists were not therapists. They were not concerned with maintaining psychological stability. They were concerned with truth, and the truth they discovered was this: the ego is a survival mechanism that has outlived its usefulness. Like training wheels on a bicycle, it is necessary during early development, but becomes an obstacle once basic stability is achieved. The via negativa of the alchemists, the path of negation, of stripping away false identities, proceeds through systematic questioning of every attribute the ego claims as essential. I am my thoughts? No, because I can observe my thoughts. I am my emotions? No, because emotions arise and pass while awareness remains. I am my memories? No, because memory is notoriously reconstructive and unreliable. I am my body. No, because the body I inhabited as a child bears little physical resemblance to the body I inhabit now, yet the sense of I persists. What remains when every content of consciousness is recognized as object rather than subject? The alchemists called this the philosophical gold, but they were clear that it was not a thing to be grasped but a recognition to be allowed. The self, not Jung's self as a regulating archetype, but the self as pure awareness prior to identification, is not attained through effort, but revealed through the cessation of the effort to become something other than what already is. This is the secret Jung protected even from himself, that the entire edifice of analytical psychology, with its maps and stages and archetypes, is itself a defense mechanism against the radical simplicity of what the alchemists discovered. Consciousness is not a thing. The ego is not an entity. The self is not a goal to be achieved. These are all conceptual overlays imposed on an awareness that precedes and exceeds all concepts. The alchemical work is not about transforming the ego into something better. It is about recognizing that the ego is a grammatical error that has become habitual, the mistake of treating the activity of awareness as if it were a static entity doing the awareing. The alchemical journey cannot be rushed, cannot be abbreviated, cannot be made safe. Those who promise a comfortable path to transformation are selling spiritual bypassing disguised as wisdom. The stages of the work are not metaphors, but phenomenological descriptions of actual psychological processes that must be undergone, not merely understood intellectually. The Nigredo, descent into necessary darkness. The work begins with the Nigredo, the blackening, and it begins not when the aspirant decides to begin, but when life itself strips away the ego's defenses faster than they can be reconstructed. This is not a stage one enters voluntarily. No one chooses the Nigredo. The Nigredo chooses you. It arrives as depression that does not respond to medication, as anxiety that no amount of cognitive reframing can assuage, as the sudden collapse of a carefully constructed life that reveals it was built on foundations of sand. The Nigredo is the dark night of the soul stripped of its romantic associations. It is the direct experience of meaninglessness, of the ego's utter inability to generate meaning through its usual strategies of achievement, distraction, and self-improvement. The alchemical texts describe this stage as putrefaction, as the rotting of dead matter, and the metaphor is precise. What rots is not the true self, but the accumulated layers of false identity, the social roles, the compensatory strategies, the unconscious identifications with parental expectations, cultural narratives, and defensive patterns developed in childhood. These must decompose. There is no way to skip this stage, no way to transcend it through spiritual practice or psychological insight. The ego, faced with its own dissolution, employs every defense mechanism available. It spiritualizes the suffering, turning it into a badge of honor, a sign of spiritual advancement. It intellectualizes, analyzing the experience from a safe distance rather than surrendering to it. It seeks meaning where meaning cannot be found, desperately trying to make sense of what is fundamentally the breaking down of the sense-making apparatus itself. The aspirant in the Nigredo phase discovers something terrible. All the psychological tools that worked before, meditation, therapy, journaling, spiritual practice, suddenly stop working. This is not a failure of the tools. This is the tools revealing themselves as what they always were, ego strategies for maintaining control. The dark night continues until the aspirant stops trying to escape it, stops trying to understand it, stops trying to transform it into something useful. The albedo. The white light of detachment. If the aspirant survives the Nigredo without retreating into cynicism or spiritual bypassing, the albedo emerges, not through effort but through exhaustion. The ego, having exhausted every strategy for maintaining control, temporarily surrenders. This is not the surrender that comes from understanding, but the surrender that comes from having no energy left to resist. The albedo is characterized by a peculiar clarity, a detachment that is neither cold nor warm, but simply present. The alchemists described it as a whitening, and phenomenologically this is accurate. The world appears washed clean of the emotional colorations the ego had projected onto it. Events occur without being immediately processed through the filter of, how does this affect me? Thoughts arise without being claimed as my thoughts. Emotions pass through without being identified with. This is not the dissociation of trauma. This is the recognition that what was always taken to be the center of experience, the ego, is actually peripheral to experience itself. The center is empty, or rather, the center is everywhere and nowhere simultaneously. But here arises a profound danger that Jung recognized but did not adequately warn against. The albedo can become its own trap. The detachment can calcify into spiritual bypassing, into a refusal to engage with the messy reality of embodied existence. The aspirant mistakes the temporary clarity of the albedo for the final goal, claiming enlightenment while using that claim to avoid the unfinished psychological work of integration. The alchemists were clear. The albedo is not the goal. It is the necessary clarity that makes the next stage possible, but it is not itself the completion of the work. The citrinitas. The dawn of discrimination. Jung largely neglected the citrinitas in his later formulations, collapsing it into the rubedo or ignoring it entirely. This was an error. The citrinitas, the yellowing, the dawn, represents the critical capacity to discriminate between the movements of consciousness that arise from conditioned patterns and those that arise from unconditioned awareness. In the citrinitas, the aspirant learns to recognize the subtle ways the ego attempts to reconstitute itself. It no longer arrives as the obvious I, but as spiritual identity, as the one who has transcended the ego, as the awakened one who sees through illusion. These are more subtle forms of the same identification, more refined versions of the same mistake. The citrinitas develops what the Buddhist traditions call discriminating wisdom, the capacity to distinguish between awareness and the contents of awareness, between the self and the self-concepts that claim to represent it. This is not an intellectual discrimination, but a moment-to-moment lived recognition. It requires constant vigilance without the vigilant one, continuous attention without an attender. This stage is marked by what the texts call yellowing, because it represents the first genuine glimmers of the golden consciousness that will emerge in the rubedo. But it is still dawn, not daylight. The aspirant can sense the authentic self, but cannot yet embody it fully. There are still moments of identification, still instances where the ego reconstitutes itself in increasingly subtle forms. The rubedo, the embodied integration. The rubedo, the reddening, the final stage, is not a transcendence of embodied existence, but a full descent into it. This is where Jung's formulation becomes most useful and most limited. He understood the rubedo as the reconciliation of opposites, the sacred marriage of masculine and feminine, conscious and unconscious, spirit and matter. All of this is accurate, but it does not go far enough. The rubido is the recognition that there never was an ego to dissolve, a self to transcend, a goal to achieve. There is only consciousness playing hide-and-seek with itself, only awareness temporarily forgetting its nature, and then remembering. The rubido is not an attainment, but a relaxation into what was always already the case. But, and this is critical, this recognition does not produce a floating, disembodied awareness. It produces a human being who is fully present to the reality of embodied existence without being identified with any particular aspect of that existence. The aspirant in the rubido stage lives in the world, engages with others, experiences joy and sorrow, makes decisions and takes actions, but does so without the weight of self-importance, without the anxiety of self-preservation, without the suffering that comes from identification with transient phenomena. The philosophical goal of the alchemists is not a state to be maintained, but a recognition that cannot be lost once genuinely seen. It is the direct apprehension that the one seeking transformation and the obstacle to transformation were always the same movement of consciousness, the same awareness temporarily identifying with its own contents. Every authentic spiritual path includes a crisis point, a moment when the aspirant confronts not merely difficulty, but absolute despair. This is not the dramatic despair of tragedy, not the romantic suffering of the tormented artist. This is the quiet, total recognition that every strategy has failed, every hope has proven illusory, every path leads nowhere. The alchemists called this the blackest black within the Nigredo, the moment when even the work itself is revealed as another ego strategy, another attempt by the false self to maintain continuity under the guise of transformation. The aspirant realizes that every spiritual practice, every meditation session, every moment of insight has been secretly undertaken with the expectation of a payoff, with the hidden agenda of becoming someone better, more enlightened, more whole. Jung documented this crisis in his own life during the years he chronicled in the Red Book, though he never fully articulated its significance. He experienced the complete breakdown of his own psychological theories, the failure of his conceptual frameworks to protect him from the raw encounter with the unconscious. His dreams and visions during this period were not merely symbolic communications from the psyche, but the direct confrontation with the inadequacy of the ego mind to comprehend its own source. What Jung did not emphasize, perhaps because it was clinically dangerous to do so, was that this crisis cannot be resolved. It can only be surrendered to. Every attempt to understand it, transcend it, integrate it, or derive meaning from it is the ego's attempt to survive the very process designed to dissolve it. The aspirant in crisis faces what the existentialists called the absurd, the recognition that human consciousness demands meaning in a universe that offers none. But where the existentialists concluded that meaning must therefore be self-created, the alchemists recognized something more radical. The demand for meaning is itself the problem. The ego structure requires narrative continuity, causal explanation, purpose and direction. Remove these requirements and what remains is not nihilism, but the direct encounter with existence prior to interpretation. This is where many spiritual paths fail their adherents. They offer new meanings, better narratives, more sophisticated interpretations, all of which are subtle ways of avoiding the genuine crisis. The alchemists were more honest. They described this stage as death, as dismemberment, as the dissolution of the aspirant in the alchemical vessel. They did not promise that it would feel good or make sense or lead to happiness. They promised only that it was necessary. The crisis deepens when the aspirant recognizes that there is no one to save them from it. Not a guru, not a tradition, not a practice, not even their own insight or understanding. The very consciousness seeking rescue from the crisis is the crisis. The one who wants to transcend suffering is the source of suffering. The self that desires to become enlightened is the obstacle to enlightenment. This realization does not produce peace. It produces a kind of existential vertigo, a dizziness that comes from recognizing that there is no solid ground, that there never was, that the sense of standing on firm psychological and philosophical foundations was itself an elaborate construction maintained through enormous unconscious effort. And yet, and this is the paradox that cannot be resolved intellectually, this recognition is itself the beginning of genuine transformation, not because it leads somewhere, not because it produces a better state of consciousness, but because it is the direct seeing through of the illusion that there is someone who needs to get somewhere. The crisis resolves not through transcendence, but through the exhaustion of the crisis maker. The dark night continues until the aspirant stops asking when it will end, stops trying to extract lessons from it, stops using it as material for spiritual identity. It continues until there is simply the darkness, without commentary, without hope of escape, without the one who is experiencing the darkness. This is not a teaching that can be given directly. It can only be recognized by those who have exhausted every alternative. What emerges from the alchemical process is not a new self, but the recognition that there never was an old self to begin with. This is not wordplay. This is the phenomenological reality that becomes self-evident once the ego's defensive structures cease to operate automatically. The individual who completes the great work does not become special, enlightened, or superior to others. If anything, they become more ordinary, more human, more present to the simple reality of being alive without the constant mediation of self-concept. They laugh, weep, work, rest, relate to others, but without the exhausting subtext of self-reference that colors every experience for those still identified with the ego structure. Jung called this the individuation process, but even this terminology is misleading. It implies that there is an individual who undergoes a process, that there is a self that becomes more itself through development. The alchemical texts are more precise. What happens is not that the false self becomes the true self, but that the activity of self-making is recognized as unnecessary. This does not produce the blank emptiness feared by those who have never questioned their own existence. It produces a vivid immediacy, a contact with reality unmediated by the constant evaluation and judgment that the ego imposes. Colors are more vibrant, not because perception has improved, but because the filter of my experience of color has dissolved into simply color. Relationships become more genuine, not because interpersonal skills have developed, but because the subtle manipulation of others to confirm one's self-concept has ceased. The integrated individual, if we must use such language, lives from presence rather than pattern, from spontaneous response rather than conditioned reaction. This is not the spontaneity of impulse, but the spontaneity that arises when action is no longer distorted by the need to maintain a consistent self-image. But here we must be precise about what integration means. It does not mean that the personality disappears, that preferences cease, that the capacity for planning and reflection vanishes. The human organism continues to function, to have tendencies and inclinations, to move through the world in particular ways. What integrates is not the contents of consciousness, but the relationship to those contents. The thoughts still arise, probably the same thoughts, with the same neurotic patterns, the same habitual associations, but they are recognized as movements in consciousness rather than as property of a self. Emotions still occur, anger, fear, joy, sorrow, but without the secondary suffering that comes from identifying with them or believing they mean something about who you are. The integrated human being has not transcended suffering. They have transcended the suffering about suffering, the anxiety about anxiety, the depression about depression. Pain remains pain, but it is no longer compounded by the narrative overlay of, why is this happening to me? Or what does this mean about me? Or how can I make this stop? This is why the alchemical texts insist that the philosophical gold is found where it was always present. Nothing new is created, nothing is added. The work of alchemy is entirely subtractive, entirely a process of removing the obscurations that prevent recognition of what is already the case. And yet, and this must be acknowledged, the individual who has completed this recognition continues to function in a world where others have not. They interact with egos without identifying with ego, participate in the collective delusion without being deluded themselves. This requires a kind of skillful navigation that Jung called psychological sophistication, but which might better be described as compassion, the recognition that others are suffering from the same mistaken identity, the same case of mistaken selfhood that one has seen through. The work does not end. The recognition, once genuine, cannot be lost, but its embodiment continues to deepen, continues to reveal new subtleties of identification that were too refined to be seen initially. The philosophical gold once found must be continually refound, not because it is ever lost, but because consciousness has an infinite capacity to appropriate even non-identification as a new form of identity. The alchemist who has completed the great work stands before the furnace once more, not as someone who has achieved something, but as no one at all, as simple presence aware of its own nature, as consciousness that has stopped pretending to be a thing. The gold you seek is not in the crucible, but in the recognition that there never was a seeker to begin with, only seeking, mistaking itself for someone doing the seeking.